Welcome to War and Peace, Part 2, an online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. As you can probably imagine, no one, not the French, not the British, not the Japanese, not Woodrow Wilson, and certainly not the Germans, were entirely satisfied with the outcome of the Paris Peace Conference. But Wilson believed that he had secured the key to world peace, the League of Nations. The president returned home triumphantly and told an audience that, at last, the world knows America as the savior of the world. But Wilson had overestimated support for the League of Nations among the American people. Some thought Wilson had given too much away to the other allies in Paris and produced a peace that was unjust. German Americans represented the largest ethnic minority in the U.S., and most were angered at Germany's treatment. And Irish Americans, another large group, tended to think that the treaty was too pro-British, which upset them. More than 100,000 Americans had died fighting World War I, and for what? For a League of Nations? The feeling that the U.S. had made a mistake by giving up its neutrality and joining the war was already beginning to take root. This feeling would grow even stronger in the years to come. Then Wilson submitted the Treaty of Versailles to the U.S. Senate, and everything began to fall apart. According to the Constitution, approval of 2/3 of the Senate is needed for the United States to ratify or sign on to any treaty with foreign nations, even one that the president has already negotiated. Without Senate ratification, America could not join the League of Nations. Wilson told senators that failure to ratify the treaty would break the heart of the world. The Senate had a slight Republican majority in 1919, and Wilson was a Democrat. This meant that in order to gain the approval of 2/3 of the senators, the president needed to have not only all the Democrats on board, but quite a few Republicans as well. The treaty's bitterest opponents in the Senate, a group of isolationist Republicans, called themselves irreconcilables. This name meant that they would not change their minds or budge in their views under any circumstances. These senators opposed any treaty that entangled the U.S. in world affairs. Some of them had voted against going to war with Germany in 1917. Other Republicans weren't as isolationist but still worried that if the U.S. joined the League of Nations, the nation might lose some of its independence. What if the League decided something in the interests of world peace that happened to work against America's own interests? Would the U.S. be dragged into future wars against its will? Politics definitely played a role. If the Senate ratified the treaty, Wilson's Democratic Party would have foreign policy triumph to boast about in 1920, an election year. Republicans who hoped to take back the White House weren't too keen to see that happen. President Wilson's greatest enemy in the Senate was Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican from Massachusetts. Lodge didn't just dislike the president's ideas about foreign policy, he disliked the man himself. "I never thought I could hate a man as much as I hate Wilson," he once wrote. Lodge wasn't an isolationist, he was an imperialist who believed in using America's military might around the world. But he believed America should do so only on its own terms. What if the League of Nations ordered U.S. troops into action to solve an overseas crisis? Lodge found that unacceptable, and he was the unofficial leader of the Senate's Republicans. At Lodge's prompting, the Senate proposed several amendments or reservations to the treaty. One said that if the U.S. were to join the League of Nations, then the Senate and House of Representatives would still have to vote to approve any military action the League required. This went against Woodrow Wilson's vision of the League of Nations. If member nations could pick and choose when they wanted to participate in the League's actions, then it wasn't really a League of Nations at all. But it soon became obvious that Lodge had too much power in the Senate to pass the treaty without his cooperation. Democratic senators urged Wilson to compromise with Lodge and accept the amendments. Surely, they argued, a League of Nations with some stipulations was better than none at all. But the president would not budge. He wasn't shy about his hatred for Lodge when asked to adopt the treaty with the Lodge reservations. "Never. I'll never consent to adopt any policy with which that impossible name is so prominently identified." Instead of waiting for a watered-down version of his treaty to reach the Senate for a vote, Woodrow Wilson did something very unusual. He embarked on a train journey across the United States, planning to speak directly to the American people to drum up support for the League of Nations. This wasn't something politicians generally did at this time, even if they were running for president, which Wilson wasn't. Instead, he was hoping to take his case to the people in the hopes that they would rise up and demand that their senators ratify the treaty. It was to be the longest and most ambitious speaking tour a president had ever taken, and Wilson was an older man, not in the best of health to begin with. His doctors advised him against going on the trip. On September 3rd, the president set off on an 8,000-mile tour of his country. The train on which he traveled was called the Mayflower. The president made dozens of stops, greeted hundreds of thousands of people, and gave passionate speeches at every opportunity. He suffered from nearly constant headaches. Wilson's train traveled to California and back again. He became more and more exhausted. In Pueblo, Colorado, on the evening of September 25th, the president suffered a severe physical breakdown from which he would never fully recover. He wanted to continue his tour. "If I cancel this trip, Senator Lodge and his friends will say that I'm a quitter and that the Western trip was a failure and the treaty will be lost. I want to show them that I can still fight and that I am not afraid." Wilson's wife and his doctors assured him that no one would ever consider him a quitter, but that he needed to return home. The presidential train raced back to Washington. Those who saw Woodrow Wilson when he returned to the White House said he looked like a ghost of the man who had left earlier that month. Still, the president seemed to show small signs of recovery. Then, on October 2nd, he suffered a massive stroke that left him paralyzed on his left side and mostly blind. For months, no one outside of Wilson's doctors and his wife knew how serious his condition was. The president did not take visitors and was largely unable to govern. Eventually, Wilson was able to send a written message to Senate Democrats telling them to accept no compromises, amendments, or reservations to the League of Nations Treaty. He got what he wanted. In March 1920, the original version of the treaty went before the full Senate for a vote. By 6 votes, it failed to be ratified. The United States did not and never would join the League of Nations. The League of Nations became a reality even without the United States. Between 1920 and 1946, the years of the League's existence, almost every other nation in the world joined at one point. You can see them on the map here in a variety of colors. Only the nations in gray were not League members. But the League of Nations proved to be an ineffective organization, far from what Woodrow Wilson had envisioned. It had some minor successes in the 20s, settling border disputes and resolving some international conflicts. But in the 1930s, the world once again became a dangerous place, and the League failed utterly in its main goal, to prevent another world war. The League of Nations didn't have its own armed forces, so it depended entirely on the will of its member states to stop aggression. When Japan invaded Manchuria, a region of China, in 1931, the League strongly condemned the action and told the Japanese to withdraw. But instead of complying, Japan simply quit the League of Nations, and nothing happened. Later in the decade, as Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany and defiantly violated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the League's member states proved unwilling to stop him by going to war. When Italy invaded Ethiopia and when Spain broke out into civil war, the League of Nations failed to take action. World War II began in 1939 and lasted until 1945. It was an even bloodier and more destructive conflict than the First World War had been. After the war, a new and far stronger international organization, the United Nations, would take the place of the former League of Nations. Clearly, World War I was not, as many had called it, the war to end all wars. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was a failure, if its outcome was to secure world peace for the future. It failed to solve the underlying problems that had unsettled the world, and in fact, it created many new ones. Historians today have a tendency to view the 2 world wars as one enormous global conflict, with a 20-year ceasefire in the middle. The what-ifs of this period in history are endless. What if the Treaty of Versailles had been less vindictive to Germany? Would that have prevented the rise of Hitler and the Holocaust? What if Woodrow Wilson had been more flexible, or if the U.S. had joined the League of Nations? Would it then have been a more effective organization? What if the U.S. had stayed out of World War I entirely? Would that have led to a more balanced outcome in Europe that might have prevented another world war? No one knows the answers to these questions, but that doesn't stop historians from asking them. And what became of Woodrow Wilson after the stroke he suffered in 1919? Wilson remained the president for another year and a half until his term was finished, but he remained in extremely poor health. He was basically an invalid for the rest of his presidency, rarely appearing in public or interacting with his cabinet. Only a handful of people had access to the president, and his wife Edith Wilson handled all of his correspondence and made many important decisions on behalf of her husband. It's debatable, but many historians believe that Wilson should have resigned the presidency under these circumstances. But he did not, and remained in office until 1921, when Warren G. Harding, a Republican, took office, promising the American people a return to normalcy.